My mother was dying, and the only cure cost more than my entire life. So I agreed to the impossible, to become my wealthy boss's wife for a weekend. The smell of lemon polish and ammonia was the perfume of my life. It clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. I was a ghost in other people's homes, a silent witness to lives I could never afford. And no home was more of a different universe than the penthouse apartment of Mr. Julian Sterling. It was less a home and more an art gallery for minimalism, a sterile expanse of white marble, black leather, and glass that overlooked the entire city like a God's eye view. I spent 3 days a week there, scrubbing, polishing, and making myself invisible. Mr. Sterling himself was as cold and sharp as the edges of his glass coffee table. We rarely spoke. A curt nod in the morning, a quiet "thank you" left on a sticky note. I was just part of the machinery that kept his perfect world running. That day the machinery broke. My phone, usually silent in my pocket, vibrated against my leg. I knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that it was the hospital. I ducked into the cavernous pantry, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was Dr. Evans. His voice was gentle, which was always the worst sign. "Eleanor," he began, "we have the latest test results for your mother." I held my breath, leaning against a shelf stacked with artisanal olive oils that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. "The cardiomyopathy is progressing faster than we anticipated. The standard treatments, they're not going to be enough. There is an option, however, an experimental procedure in Switzerland. The success rate is promising, very promising." A tiny, fragile seed of hope sprouted in my chest. "Okay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Okay, what do we need to do?" There was a pause. The professional, gentle voice turned hesitant. "Eleanor, the cost is substantial. It's not covered by any insurance. We're talking about $250,000. The seed of hope didn't just wither. It was incinerated. $250,000. The number was so absurd, so utterly disconnected from my reality, I almost laughed. It might as well have been $1 billion. My world shrunk to the size of a pinprick. I could hear my mother's weak, rattling breath in my memory. I could see her tired smile, the way her hands, once so strong, now looked like pale, fragile birds resting on the hospital blanket, and I started to cry. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but silent, hot tears that slipped down my face and dripped onto the pristine tile floor. I slid down the wall, my cleaning rag falling from my hand, the dream of saving her turning to ash in my mouth. That's how he found me. The pantry door swung open, and Mr. Sterling stood there, silhouetted by the bright lights of the kitchen. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, holding an espresso cup. He stopped short, his brow furrowing in annoyance, I thought, at finding me crumpled in his pantry. "What is this?" he asked, his voice clipped and impatient. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, trying to hide my face. Mortification washed over me, crying in front of the boss. Rule number 1, broken, but the dam had burst. "It's my mother," I finally choked out. "She's sick. There's a surgery, but I can't. He stared at me for a long moment. I expected him to dismiss me, to tell me to pull myself together and get back to work. Instead, he did something I never would have predicted. He closed the door, shutting us into the small, quiet space. "How much?" he asked, his voice devoid of pity, purely transactional. $250,000, I whispered, the number feeling like a physical weight on my tongue. He was silent. He took a sip of his espresso, his sharp gray eyes never leaving my face. He seemed to be calculating, weighing variables in some complex equation I couldn't begin to understand. "I have a problem, Elena," he said finally, his tone shifting. "A problem money, in its usual form, can't solve. But perhaps you can." I looked up, confused, wiping my tears with the back of my hand. "Me? What could I possibly do for you?" "I need a wife," he said flatly. "A temporary one. My grandmother is dying. Her will stipulates that I inherit the family estate and controlling shares of the company only if I am, in her words, stably and respectably married. She's old-fashioned. She wants to see me settled before she goes." I stared at him, utterly bewildered. So, hire an actress? Too risky, he dismissed with a wave of his hand. Gossip, blackmail, the possibility of her being recognized. I need someone entirely removed from my world. Someone who is trustworthy, discreet, and has no connections that could expose the arrangement. Someone who is already inside my home, who I know isn't a reporter or a corporate spy. His gaze was intense, analytical. Someone like you. The proposal hung in the air between us, smelling of coffee and desperation. My desperation. You want me, a cleaner, to pretend to be your wife? The idea was insane. For one weekend, he clarified. We go to the family estate. You meet my grandmother. You are charming, devoted, and completely in love with me. In return, I will wire the full amount for your mother's surgery to the hospital in Switzerland. No questions asked. A favor for a favor. My mind was reeling, lying to a dying old woman, stepping into a world of unimaginable wealth and privilege, a world where I would be an imposter at every turn. It felt wrong, dirty, impossible. But then the image of my mother's face flashed in my mind again. Her life was on one side of the scale, and my pride and a harmless deception were on the other. It wasn't a choice at all. I'll do it, I said, my voice barely a whisper. A flicker of something crossed his face. Relief? Triumph? It was gone before I could name it. He nodded once curtly. Good. The transformation begins now. We have 48 hours. The next 2 days were a blur. I was pulled from my life and plunged into his. There were fittings with stern-faced designers, lessons in etiquette from a woman who looked at me like I was a stray cat she was being forced to domesticate, and hours spent studying a biography of my life with Julian, our fake first meeting, our fake first date, our fake engagement. I was given clothes that cost more than my car and jewelry that felt like shackles on my skin. By the time we were standing by his private helicopter, ready to leave for the estate, I was a nervous wreck. I was wearing a simple but elegant cashmere dress. My hair was styled. My nails were manicured. I looked in the reflection of the helicopter's window and saw a stranger. Julian handed me a glass of champagne. You look the part, he said, his voice as neutral as ever. Just remember the story. You were a freelance art curator I met at a gallery. We fell in love with a Monet, and then with each other. It's simple. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He put on his sunglasses, his face becoming an unreadable mask. We were about to board when he paused and turned back to me. There's one last detail I neglected to mention, he said, his tone casual, but his eyes, behind the dark lenses, seemed to hold a warning. My grandmother, in her infinite wisdom, decided to invite a few other guests to celebrate our happy news. Just so you're prepared, my ex-fiancée, Amelia, will be there. Amelia. The name dropped into the roar of the helicopter blades like a shard of ice. My blood ran cold. My carefully constructed, fragile composure threatened to shatter before we even landed. An ex-fiancé? This wasn't part of the deal. This was a landmine planted directly in the middle of our paper-thin story. You didn't think that was important to mention? I shouted over the engine's whine, my voice tight with panic. Julian barely turned his head, his sunglasses still fixed on the sprawling green landscape below. It's a complication, nothing more, he said, his voice calm, infuriatingly so. She's a part of the family tapestry. Her being here is to be expected. It changes nothing. You are an art curator named Elena Cruz. You are in love with me. That is all you need to know. But it wasn't all, and we both knew it. Amelia wouldn't just be a guest, she would be a judge. She would have memories, inside jokes, a shared history that I couldn't possibly replicate. She would look at me and see a fraud from a mile away. The champagne in my hand suddenly felt like poison. I set it down, my palms sweating. My mother's face swam in my mind, a desperate anchor in a sea of terror. I had to do this. For her. The estate was not like the penthouse. The penthouse was new money, all sharp lines and cold, impersonal luxury. This was old money. The house, a sprawling stone beast called Blackwood Manor, looked like it had grown out of the earth itself, covered in ivy and steeped in secrets. A butler who looked about 100 years old greeted us at a massive oak door. As we stepped into the grand foyer, with its soaring ceilings, dark wood paneling, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. The air smelled of beeswax, old books, and money so old it was practically fossilized. A frail-looking woman with a cloud of white hair was waiting for us in a cavernous drawing room, seated in a high-backed armchair near a roaring fire. This had to be Beatrice Sterling, the matriarch. Julian's hand rested for a moment on the small of my back, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate, but felt more like a warden guiding a prisoner. "Grandmother," Julian said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "This is Elena." I stepped forward, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice coming out as a breathless squeak. Beatrice Sterling might have been physically frail, but her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, were as sharp as chips of flint. She scanned me from head to toe, a slow, deliberate appraisal that made me feel like an item up for auction. "So," she said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves, "you're the one who finally tamed my wild grandson." "An art curator," he tells me. "Yes," I managed, clutching my ridiculously expensive handbag like a life raft. "That's right. Art." She sniffed, as if the word itself was distasteful. "A frivolous pursuit. But I suppose it keeps one occupied. Tell me, child, what do you think of the Pre-Raphaelites? A gaudy mess, in my opinion. It was a test, the first of many. I dredged up a line Julian had coached me on during our crash course. I find their romanticism a bit overwhelming, but their attention to detail and symbolism is undeniable." A flicker of something maybe approval passed through her ancient eyes. "A diplomatic answer. Very well." She turned her gaze to Julian. "I'm glad you are here. I'm glad you are settling." The word was heavy with meaning. Just as I allowed myself a tiny, internal sigh of relief, a voice like honey laced with venom echoed from the doorway. "Julian, darling, you made it." And there she was. Amelia. She wasn't just beautiful, she was breathtaking. A vision in emerald silk that clung to a figure sculpted by personal trainers and privilege. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her smile a dazzling weapon. She didn't walk into a room, she took possession of it. She glided over to Julian, kissing him on both cheeks with an intimacy that made my stomach clench. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, then landed on me. They swept over my dress, my hair, my face, and her perfect smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. "And you must be Elena," she said, extending a hand weighed down by a diamond ring the size of a small bird's egg. "I've heard so much about you." It was a lie, a beautiful, polished lie, and a clear challenge. "It's a pleasure," I said, my hand feeling rough and clumsy in her smooth, cool grasp. The four of us sat, the air crackling with unspoken tension. Julian was a fortress of calm, Beatrice was an observant hawk, and Amelia was a predator circling her prey. She directed all her questions to me, each one a subtle probe designed to find a crack in my story. She asked about galleries in Paris, artists I supposedly knew, exhibitions I'd curated. I parried as best I could, relying on the flimsy biography Julian had built for me, feeling sweat trickle down my back. Then she leaned forward, her blue eyes sparkling with manufactured delight. "But of course what I really want to hear is the story of how you two met. Julian is always so private, but it must have been divinely romantic." She looked from him to me. "The gallery," he said, "in front of the Monet." "That's right," Julian said, his voice a smooth warning note. "The water lilies." Amelia smiled, a perfect predatory curve of her lips. "Oh, I remember that exhibit so well. It was stunning." She paused, her gaze locking onto mine, her expression turning deceptively thoughtful. "But Julian, darling, you never mentioned that they'd rearranged the collection. Wasn't the Monet always in the East Wing, right next to that dreadful modern sculpture you hated so much?" She turned her brilliant, expectant gaze back to me, the trap sprung and gleaming. "You must remember it, Elena. The lighting in that corner was just terrible, wasn't it?" The silence in the room was a physical weight. 3 pairs of eyes were locked on me, each waiting for a different reason. Amelia's were gleaming with triumph, the hunter waiting for the snare to snap shut. Beatrice's were narrowed, her ancient mind sifting through my every flicker of expression for deceit. And Julian's, his were unreadable behind a mask of indifference, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. My mind was a blank, roaring void. The East Wing, a sculpture? I had no idea. The lie was about to unravel, and my mother's life would unravel with it. Then a memory surfaced, not of a gallery in Paris, but of Mr. Sterling's penthouse. I remembered scrubbing his marble floors, noticing how the afternoon sun hit them just so, revealing every single streak I'd missed. I remembered cleaning the massive glass wall in his living room, seeing how the city lights at dusk reflected and distorted, creating a galaxy on the pane. I knew light, I knew surfaces, and I knew how they interacted. I took a slow, deliberate breath, channeling a confidence I didn't feel. Terrible is one word for it, I began, my voice steady, surprising even myself. I looked directly at Amelia, meeting her challenge head-on. I found it fascinating, actually. The direct overhead spotlights completely flattened the impasto. You lost all the texture of Monetti's brushwork. It was a curatorial choice I found very aggressive. I paused, letting the art world jargon settle in the air. Then I turned my gaze to Julian, a soft private smile playing on my lips. But in a way, it made the moment more special. It felt like we were the only two people in the world who could see the painting for what it truly was. Everyone else just saw a flat image, but we saw the soul of it. Didn't we, darling? Julian's mask finally cracked. Just for a second, a look of genuine astonishment, quickly followed by profound relief, flashed in his eyes. He reached over and took my hand, his grip firm and warm. "We did," he said, his voice laced with a new, unfamiliar sincerity. It was our own private masterpiece. Amelia's perfect smile faltered. She had been beaten at her own game. Beside the fire, Beatrice Sterling made a small, almost imperceptible noise, a dry little sound of approval. The test was over. I had passed. The rest of the weekend was a strange dream. Amelia kept her distance, shooting daggers at me from across the dinner table, but she made no more attempts to expose me. And something shifted between Julian and me. He started to look at me, really look at me, not as the cleaner or the actress, but as Eleanor. He'd catch my eye and give me a small conspiratorial nod. During a walk through the gardens, he quietly pointed out his grandmother's favorite roses, telling me a story about how he'd fallen into the thorns as a boy. It was a tiny crack in his marble facade, a glimpse of the real man underneath. The most surprising thing, however, was Beatrice. The morning we were set to leave, she requested to see me alone in her conservatory. I walked in, terrified, expecting a final interrogation. She was sitting among the orchids, the morning light making her white hair glow. "You're not an art curator, are you, child?" she asked, her voice soft. My blood turned to ice. It was over. "No," I whispered, my eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm not." "I know," she said simply. "Amelia may be a viper, but she isn't stupid. She would have found a real art curator's credentials in an hour. But you have something she will never have." She gestured for me to come closer. "You have a good heart. I saw you yesterday speaking to the gardener about his wife's arthritis. You didn't know I was watching." She reached out a frail, bird-like hand and patted mine. "My grandson has surrounded himself with glass and steel his entire life. He needs warmth. He needs grounding. Whatever the arrangement is between you two," she gave me a sharp look, "I approve." On the helicopter ride back, the silence was different. It wasn't tense or awkward anymore. It was comfortable, contemplative. We flew over the city, the buildings glinting in the sun, and I thought about how just a few days ago I had been an invisible ghost in one of them. As the helicopter landed on the roof of his building, Julian turned to me, his sunglasses off, his gray eyes serious. "The hospital in Switzerland received a wire transfer for the full amount an hour ago," he said. Tears sprang to my eyes, hot and immediate. Tears of relief so profound they felt like they were washing away years of worry. "Thank you," I whispered, the words feeling impossibly small. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." "The deal is fulfilled, Eleanor," he said formally. but then he hesitated. However, the arrangement was for a weekend. I find myself wondering what could happen on a Monday. I looked at him, really looked at him. The cold, intimidating Mr. Sterling was gone. In his place was Julian, a man who told stories about rose thorns and who looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, but it made my heart beat faster. I had what I needed. My mother was safe. I was free. I could walk away right now, back to my world of lemon polish and ammonia, and this entire weekend would become a surreal memory. But for the first time, I felt like I had a choice, not a choice between desperation and impossibility, but a real one. I thought of his hand in mine, of his surprised smile, of the man behind the mask. I smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Let's start with dinner," I said, my voice clear and steady. "And this time, you can tell me what you really think about the lighting.